In the early 17th century, the world was a vast and mysterious place. Oceans stretched endlessly, dotted with treacherous reefs, violent storms, and hidden dangers. Sailors navigated by the stars, guided by compasses that often failed, and maps that were sometimes no more than guesses. A single mistake could mean death. Pirates lurked in every strait, and even the most experienced captains feared the unknown. Meanwhile, in the low-lying lands of the Netherlands, a small republic was stirring with ambition. Unlike Spain, Portugal, or England, the Dutch had no massive armies, no gold mines, no centuries-old monarchies to command loyalty. What they did have was determination, ingenuity, and a merchant class that thrived on risk. Their cities, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Hoorn, buzzed with activity. Ships docked in the harbors, warehouses overflowed with textiles, wine, and imported goods, and the streets were filled with merchants calculating their next move. It was a nation with little by conventional standards, but with ambition that knew no bounds. And the Dutch were about to gamble everything on the most dangerous, yet potentially lucrative enterprise imaginable, controlling the spice trade of the East Indies. Spices, nutmeg, cloves, pepper, were worth more than silver. They were treasures, sought by kings, nobles, and merchants alike. A single shipment could transform fortunes, elevate status, and even influence politics. For decades, Portugal and Spain had maintained near-total control over this trade, protected by heavily armed fleets and fortified ports scattered across the Indian Ocean. But the Dutch were not deterred. They had studied the maps, the currents, the winds, and the weaknesses of their rivals. They believed that with careful planning, courage, and a willingness to take risks, they could challenge the old empires without kings or armies. Trade itself could become a weapon. Imagine a fleet of Dutch ships leaving the harbor of Amsterdam at dawn. The sail catch the first rays of the sun. The decks creak under the weight of cargo, cannons, and men. The sailors are a mix of hardened veterans and eager young men, each aware that storms, disease, and pirates might await them. But the potential reward was vast: control of the world's most valuable commodities. Captain Cornelis van der Hagen wrote in his logbook, "We leave behind the comfort of home and the certainty of familiar streets. Ahead lies the unknown, where danger and fortune sail together. Our courage is our only guarantee." The stakes were not just personal, they were national. Success meant wealth for investors, dominance for the Netherlands, and a legacy that could reshape history. Failure meant financial ruin, loss of ships, or death in a distant, unknown ocean. Yet even as these ships sailed out into the horizon, the Dutch were not naive. They knew their rivals would fight, that storms could sink their vessels, that illness could decimate crews. Every decision, from the choice of captain to the route taken, was a calculated risk. But for the Dutch, risk was opportunity. And in 1602, the Vereenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the VOC, was born. It was the world's first multinational corporation, an enterprise designed to outmaneuver empires, conquer markets, and profit from the farthest reaches of the globe. Even before the first spices were loaded, the VOC represented a revolution. Not a kingdom, not an army, but a bold experiment in commerce, diplomacy, and, when necessary, force. The stage was set. The gamble had begun. And the world would soon bear witness to an empire built on ambition, courage, and the treacherous waters of the East Indies. In March 1602, in a quiet room filled with the scent of old parchment and expensive tobacco, a stroke of a pen changed the world forever. The States General of the Netherlands signed a charter that did something unthinkable. It gave a private company the powers of a god. The Vereenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the VOC, was born. But this wasn't just a business deal. It was a declaration of war against the status quo. The VOC was granted a terrifying set of rights. They could build fortresses, hire private armies, and execute anyone who stood in the way of their profit. They were a paper empire, a corporation that functioned like a sovereign nation, answerable to no king, only to their balance sheets. The great gamble. But where would the money come from? To challenge the might of the Spanish and Portuguese empires, the Dutch needed a mountain of gold. They turned to the people. In a move that birthed modern capitalism, the VOC opened its books to the public. Imagine the scene. A chaotic house in Amsterdam where commoners, bakers, blacksmiths, and even domestic servants waited in line to hand over their life savings. They weren't just buying goods. They were buying a piece of history. This was the world's first initial public offering, IPO. They raised 6.5 million guilders, an astronomical sum that made the English East India Company look like a local corner shop. The Dutch people were all in on a gamble that spanned the globe. The Lords of Shadow. At the top of this pyramid sat the Heeren the 17th, the Lord 17. These were not warriors or explorers. They were cold, calculating businessmen who met in secret rooms. They looked at maps not for beauty, but for bottlenecks. They looked at islands not as homes, but as assets. From their desks in the Netherlands, they moved ships like chess pieces across a board they had never seen, demanding one thing above all else: total monopoly, the wooden hell. While the Lord 17 counted their coins, the men on the ships were entering a living nightmare. To reach the East Indies, a Dutch retour ship had to survive the Atlantic graveyard and the Roaring Forties. For 8 months, hundreds of men were packed into a wooden hull that reeked of rot, vomit, and fear. The scurvy, it was a silent, gruesome predator. First, your joints would ache. Then, your gums would turn black and swell until they covered your teeth. Old scars from years ago would mysteriously rip open as the body literally began to fall apart. The madness. Imagine being trapped in a storm for weeks, the ship groaning under waves the size of cathedrals, knowing that if you hit a reef, there is no rescue. Only the dark, cold depths of the ocean. One sailor's diary from the era captures the grim reality. The water in our barrels is so thick and green with slime that we have to strain it through our teeth to keep the worms out. Every morning, we throw another brother into the sea. The sharks follow us like shadows, waiting for the next meal. The first contact. A cold war turns hot. When the tattered Dutch sails finally appeared on the horizon of the Spice Islands, the local sultans and Portuguese commanders didn't see traders. They saw invaders. The paper empire had arrived to claim its prize. The Dutch didn't come to haggle. They came to dominate. They found the Portuguese entrenched in massive stone forts, guarding the precious nutmeg and cloves. The air in the East Indies was thick with tension. It was a 17th century Cold War that was about to turn white-hot. The Dutch ships didn't just carry spices back to Europe, they carried cannons. The first time a VOC ship opened fire on a Portuguese galleon in the blue waters of the Banda Sea, the message was clear. The old world was dying, and a new corporate power was rising from the waves. The gamble was no longer just about money. It was about blood. The Dutch had crossed the world to find paradise, but they had brought a storm with them. The paper empire was about to be written in fire. The Dutch had the money. They had the ships. They had the mandate. But in the humid volcanic islands of the East Indies, they ran into a wall, the human spirit. The paper empire was about to meet its most ruthless architect. A man who believed that if you couldn't buy a monopoly, you had to carve it out with a sword. Enter Jan Pieterszoon Coen. If the VOC was a machine, Coen was its cold iron heart. He wasn't a diplomat, he was a visionary who saw the world in columns of profit and loss. His philosophy was simple and terrifying. Trade cannot be maintained without war, nor war without trade. To Coen, the local sultans and the English rivals weren't business partners. They were obstacles to be removed, the prize, the golden nut. The focus of Coen's obsession was a tiny cluster of volcanic outcrops called the Banda Islands. This was the only place on the planet where nutmeg grew. In London and Amsterdam, a sack of nutmeg was worth more than a life. It was a luxury so rare that people wore it in silver lockets to show off their wealth. The Bandanese were master traders. For centuries, they had sold to the Chinese, the Arabs, and the Portuguese. They wanted a free market, but the VOC demanded an exclusive contract. When the Bandanese ignored the Dutch and traded with the English for food and cloth, Coen decided that negotiation was over. The massacre of 1621. In 1621, Coen arrived in the Banda Islands with a fleet of 19 ships and a small army of mercenaries, including elite Japanese samurai. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in corporate history. Imagine the sound of drums echoing across the tropical water. The Dutch didn't just target the warriors, they targeted the culture. Coen's forces systematically hunted down the Bandanese leadership. On the island of Nera, 44 Orang Kaya, local leaders, were executed by samurai in a sacred grove. But Coen didn't stop there. To ensure the monopoly, he depopulated the islands. Thousands were killed. Thousands more were left to starve in the mountains, and those who survived were sold into slavery. The islands were then divided into parcels and handed over to retired VOC officers to run as plantations using slave labor. This wasn't trade anymore. It was a corporate colony built on the bones of its original inhabitants. "We have the nutmeg," Coen reportedly wrote back to the directors in Amsterdam. But the price was high, and the air here smells of smoke and silence. Batavia, the Queen of the East. While the blood was still drying in the bandas, Coen realized the VOC needed a nerve center, a capital. He looked at a strategic port called Jayakarta on the island of Java. In 1619, he burned the city to the ground and built a new one in the Dutch image. He named it Batavia. Batavia was a piece of Amsterdam transplanted into the tropics. It had canals, stone houses, and heavy walls. But it was a city of ghosts. The canals, built for the cold Dutch climate, became stagnant breeding grounds for malaria and cholera. It was known as the Cemetery of the East, where Europeans died by the thousands, yet more kept coming, lured by the promise of unimaginable wealth. The iron grip tightens. With Batavia as their fortress and the Banda Islands as their factory, the VOC's power became absolute. They began to dictate terms to sultans and kings. Their cannons could reach any palace on the coast, and their spies were in every port. The English, humiliated and outgunned, were forced to retreat toward India. The Portuguese were being hunted ship by ship. The VOC had become the undisputed masters of the sea. They were no longer just a company. They were a global superpower with a fleet that could change the fate of nations. But as the gold flowed into Amsterdam, and the warehouses groaned under the weight of spices, a new question emerged. How long could a company built on blood and iron sustain its own weight? The gamble was paying off, but the costs, moral, human, and financial, were starting to mount. The golden age had arrived, but it was a gold that shone with a deep crimson tint. Chapter 4. The Shadow of the Giant, 24:32 minutes. By the mid-17th century, the VOC was no longer just a company. It was a global shadow that touched every corner of the known world. From the icy waters of the north to the tropical heat of the equator, the Dutch flag, the red, white, and blue with the iconic VOC monogram, was a symbol of both immense wealth and terrifying power. But as the gold piled up in the vaults of Amsterdam, the Lord 17 realized that spices were just the beginning. To truly own the world, they needed to control the routes, the secrets, and the gates of every ocean. The Forbidden Gate, Japan, and the island of Tsushima, while other European powers were being kicked out of Asia for being too aggressive or too religious. The Dutch pulled off the ultimate diplomatic heist. In 1641, the Shogun of Japan, the most isolationist ruler on earth, expelled all foreigners on pain of death. All except the Dutch. Why? Because the Dutch didn't care about converting souls to Christianity, they only cared about the bottom line. Imagine a tiny fan-shaped artificial island in Nagasaki harbor called Tsushima. It was a high-security prison for merchants. The Dutch were forbidden from leaving the island, forbidden from practicing their religion, and watched 24/7 by Japanese guards. But through this tiny needle eye, the VOC became the only bridge between the Forbidden Kingdom and the rest of the world. They traded silk for Japanese silver and copper, mountains of it. This silver didn't go back to Europe. It went to India to buy textiles, which were then traded in the Spice Islands for nutmeg. It was a perfect, self-sustaining loop of profit that no other nation could touch. The VOC was playing 4D chess while the rest of the world was playing checkers. The halfway house, the Cape of Storms. But there was a problem. The journey from Amsterdam to Batavia was still a death trap. Ships were still losing half their crews to scurvy and exhaustion before they even reached the Indian Ocean. They needed a pit stop. In 1652, a man named Jan van Riebeck stepped onto the shore of what is now Cape Town, South Africa, under the shadow of Table Mountain. His mission, build a garden. It sounds peaceful, but it was a strategic masterstroke. The Cape Colony became the halfway house of the world. Every VOC ship stopped there to get fresh water, meat, and vegetables. It was the gas station of the 17th century. But what started as a garden quickly grew into a permanent colony, forever changing the map of Africa and creating a strategic choke point that allowed the Dutch to control the gateway between the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans. The golden rot, life in the Amsterdam canal houses. Back in the Netherlands, the wealth was becoming obscene. The golden age was at its peak. In Amsterdam, the elite didn't just walk on paved streets. They lived in palaces built on the profits of distant suffering. The Heren, the Sixth, the Fifth were now the most powerful men in the world. They sat in rooms adorned with Chinese silk, drank from porcelain cups that were worth a peasant's yearly salary, and surrounded themselves with exotic animals, lions, parrots, and monkeys brought back on VOC ships. But wealth of this scale breeds a specific kind of poison, corruption. Because it took 18 months for a letter to travel from Batavia to Amsterdam and back, the governors in the East were like kings. They began to realize they could skim off the top. They started private trading on the side, lining their own pockets with the company's gold. In the East, the VOC stood for Vereenigde Oostindische Compagnie. But behind closed doors, people began to say it stood for Vergaan under corruptie, perished under corruption, the invisible empire. By 1670, the VOC was the wealthiest private company in human history. They owned 15 merchant ships, 40 warships, a private army of 10,000 soldiers, 50,000 employees worldwide. They were paying a dividend of 40% to their shareholders. It was a financial miracle. But the giant was becoming too heavy. The English were building faster ships. The French were eyeing their ports. And inside the company, the rot was spreading from the hull to the mast. The VOC had conquered the oceans, silenced their rivals, and built a world where everything had a price. But as they looked out from their forts in Batavia and their mansions in Amsterdam, they failed to see the clouds gathering on the horizon. The gamble had won them the world. But now they had to figure out how to keep it. For a century, the VOC was the undisputed king of the world, but by the 1700s, the crown was starting to feel heavy. The company that had outcompeted empires was now suffering from the most dangerous disease of all: complacency. While the Dutch were busy polishing their gold, the world around them was shifting. The first crack didn't come from a cannonball, but from a change in taste. The world was moving on from nutmeg and cloves. In the tea-houses of London and the salons of Paris, people were clamoring for something new: Indian cotton, Chinese tea, and coffee. The British lionwakes, the English East India Company, EIC, once the VOC's scrawny younger brother, had been watching and learning. While the VOC was bogged down in the expensive business of governing islands and fighting local wars, the British were focusing on India. They realized that selling textiles to the masses was more sustainable than selling expensive spices to the elite. Slowly but surely, the British began to outmaneuver the Dutch. Their ships became faster, their bureaucracy leaner, and their presence in India gave them a stranglehold on the next big commodities. The paper empire was being outtraded at its own game. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, the final blow. The rivalry finally exploded in 1780. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War was a catastrophe for the VOC. The British Royal Navy, now the most powerful force on the seas, blockaded the Dutch coast and seized VOC ships returning from the east. Suddenly, the unstoppable fleet was trapped. Warehouses in Batavia were overflowing with goods that couldn't be shipped, while in Amsterdam the company was running out of cash. For the first time in nearly 200 years, the VOC had to ask the Dutch government for a loan. The giant was on its knees, perished under corruption. But the real killer wasn't the British. It was the rot within. The acronym VOC had long been joked about as standing for Vergaan onder corruptie, perished under corruption. And now the joke became a grim reality. The ghost sailors. Officers would list dead sailors on their payrolls and pocket their wages. The black market. High-ranking officials were running their own private trade empires on VOC ships, stealing millions from the shareholders. The debt. The company was paying out dividends it couldn't afford just to keep the stock price high. It was a 18th century Ponzi scheme. By 1790, the VOC's debt had ballooned to an unthinkable 100 million guilders. The world's first multinational corporation was effectively bankrupt. The end came not with a bang, but with a whimper. In 1795, the French Revolutionary armies marched into the Netherlands. The old Dutch Republic collapsed, replaced by the Batavian Republic under French influence. The new government looked at the VOC's books and was horrified. On December 31st, 1799, the charter was officially revoked. The most powerful company in history ceased to exist. Its debts and its territories were taken over by the state. The gamble across oceans was over. The legacy, a double-edged sword. The VOC left behind a world that was permanently altered. They didn't just trade goods. They traded cultures, diseases, and ideas. The good. They pioneered the modern world. The stock market, the concept of a corporation, and global logistics. These all trace their roots back to those smoke-filled rooms in Amsterdam. They proved that a small nation, through sheer will and organization, could dominate the globe. The bad, they left a trail of blood and exploitation. The maps they drew were written in the language of colonization. From the Banda Islands to the Cape of South Africa, the scars of their monopoly at all costs strategy would last for centuries. The final reckoning. Today we look back at the VOC with a mix of awe and discomfort. It was a miracle of human ambition and a masterclass in corporate greed. It was a company that owned 150 ships, 40 warships, and had its own army, an entity that was, for a time, more powerful than most countries on Earth. The Dutch took a gamble on the unknown. They sailed into the storms, fought for every grain of nutmeg, and built an empire of paper and iron. They showed us what happens when commerce is given the power of a state, and what happens when that power is left unchecked. The ships are gone. The spices are now common pantry items, and the Lord 17 are long dead. But the world they built, a world of global trade, stock tickers, and multinational giants, is the world we still live in today. The VOC didn't just change history, it invented the future.